Afternoon, God has sent us an elder and a witness to be our plenary speaker. Last August, we recognized the truth that we as a community, as communities, as individuals, are contaminated by a culture of white supremacy. When we began thinking of who we might invite to speak to us this summer, Ruby Sales' name was the first name that came up, and she accepted the invitation. I am so thrilled. Ruby Sales is a witness. Ruby Sales is a witness with a lifelong commitment to racial and social justice. She enters this world calling to mend the relationships with each other, with God, and with creation. And she enters this work convinced that we are not entrapped by our history. We are really blessed to have Ruby with us this afternoon. After Ruby speaks, there will be, I think, a query that she will pose to us in a period of reflection for us to respond to that query before the conclusion of the presentation.
I'd like to begin this afternoon by saying, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be relevant in this place, in this time. Amen. What a wonderful pleasure. My heart is shining as brightly as the sun on my back, for being invited to be a part of this gathering, not so much as a speaker, but as a companion on this part of your journey. And I cannot begin without thanking all of the people whose hands and hearts played a role in my being here. And to each of you, I say a hearty thank you, thank you. My heart overflows with joy and gratitude that you thought enough of me to invite me into this sacred space. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you so much for this gift. Thank you so much for the pleasure of your company and the opportunity to think with you deeply about issues that are before us as a nation. Because this is a conversation and not a speech and not a lecture, I have invited my partner, Cheryl Blankenship, to begin with a reflection that becomes a context and a starting point for how we might collectively enter the conversation, both towards our own particularities, but also towards universality. After we have engaged, we will have, after I've laid out some of the territory, Jackie will explain to you where do we go from here. And I'd like for you to think about a reflection to go deep inside, move aside any impediments that might interfere with enlarging your optics and tenderizing your hearts so that you might see clearly in ways that you did not see before we had the conversation. So the question on the table to think deeply about is what new territory did this conversation take you into, not in terms of how you see the world, but how do you contextualize yourself within the construct of the conversation. So it is an inner journey that I invite you to be a part of as we look at the world, as we look at the outside world. So, Cheryl. She's going to share with you a reflection that I've been thinking about. The thing about it is everywhere we land is an opportunity, even when we don't like the space that we're in, is an opportunity to enlarge our sights and to see the world more fully and more completely. So I'm in New York now. I've just left Atlanta, Georgia, and although it's been a very difficult journey, it has enlarged my optics about the world that we live in.
Good afternoon, friends. Call and response, you do that like the Black church. Oh, it's nice. This is a reflection that Ruby wrote several days ago. It's called A Memory from My Front Porch. Before gentrification hit D.C. in full swing, D.C. was presented in the media and in the public imagination as the murder capital of America. I lived in D.C. and did not recognize the representation of it as a dangerous, crime-ridden, drug-infested den of Black drug addicts, thugs, immoral crack mothers, and deadbeat fathers. However, the minute, and I do mean minute, Marion Barry was defeated as mayor, the press and members of the real estate industrial complex promoted it as the most livable city in America. The die was cast. Running away from the propagandized D.C., Black middle-class families in search of safe communities and schools for their children left in droves, selling their magnificent homes, some of which had been in families for generations, to white people for a steal. The minute we sold our homes, the values skyrocketed more than twofold. Once again, whites made large profits off of our backs and hard labor. We were left out of gaining access to these houses in our own communities because of racist lending practices of banks that white-balled us and refused to give us loans, or they inflated mortgage payments to levels that made it impossible for Black and brown people to economically compete. Never did the promulgators of this propaganda make a connection between the high rate of unemployment of Black men and their inability to consistently contribute to their families, nor did the propaganda consider the influence of a welfare system that required men to be absent if their families were to receive support. Instead, these representations set poor Black people up as barbarians and lazy parasites at the gate who were destroying the quality of life in D.C. and in other urban cities. Furthermore, these racist propagandas hardened our hearts against our own people so that we believed that poor Black people were dangerous threats to our safety, and we were better off without them. We therefore became unwitting agents in a scheme to disperse Black and brown people from cities while simultaneously whitening them. I first saw this phenomena although I could not name it in northern Philadelphia, which, despite the depiction of it as a drug-infested community of gangs and thugs, white people were moving in like locusts, buying our houses for a steal with loans from banks that gave them low interest rates. We need to study Chicago to discern what is really going on here.
That reflection attempts to weave together what we oftentimes see as a series of fragmented events that have no relationship to each other. It attempts to contextualize a capitalist technocracy where only a few lives are essential. It asks a fundamental question of how is the world today different than what it was yesterday? And what is the trajectory that got us here? As I thought about looking at our society today, I want to just ask you to think with me on the question of what does it mean to live in a capitalist technocracy, in a culture of fear, in a season of greed, in an era of spiritual malformation. Would you think with me on that question? Capitalist technocracy, a culture of fear, a season of greed, and an era of spiritual malformation. And that brings me to the larger question here. We've done a lot of political, social analysis about white supremacy and racism, but we've missed the essential point that first and foremost, it is a spiritual malformation. And so the question is, once we understand that it is indeed a spiritual malformation that distorts and minimizes our relationship with each other, God, and all aspects of creation, the obvious question is, where do we go from here? The obvious question is, where do we go from here? What does it mean to say that we're on an inner and outer journey when our total lens, we look at the world through material optics? To talk about white supremacy in terms of power, economic, and social relations, that's true, but it's also highly materialistic, and it doesn't talk about the spiritual dimensions of white supremacy. And what I want to say spiritually is that white supremacy is a spiritual malformation that wounds all of us. And so the question is, where does it hurt? Where does it hurt? Where is the gaping wound in each of us individually and collectively that we need to attend to? What does it mean to bow down at the altar of whiteness as the ultimate God and as the supreme good? White supremacy is idolatry. And the guardians of that system want us to believe that they are the Alpha and Omega of our sitting down and our getting up. And to them we should owe our obedience and our gratitude. Just think about that. It reminds me of the Greeks who envied the place of the gods. White supremacists want to be God. They have a God envy. When you rifle through European history, I was thinking, what does it mean to call a king your grace? Or someone from the aristocracy your grace? When we really interrogate that, what does that really mean? I was talking with Jackie this morning, or actually this afternoon as we had lunch, because I'm always struck, profoundly struck, by how white people, many white people whom I know, always talk about safe spaces. What is this compulsive need for safe spaces? What is the correlation between that impulse and white supremacy that tells white people that the world is a very unsafe place and there are all these others out there who want what you have, and if they have what you have, then you will no longer exist as you are. What the empire promises white people for the trade-off of smallness and for existentialist and spiritual suicide is safety, is the ability to exist in a womb-like stage. In a womb-like stage. Unlike the child who breaks away from the mother's womb and goes to the birth canal, and while that part of the life dies, another life is born. So death is not antithetical to birth. It is a simultaneous process. But white supremacy says that the ideology, the bankrupt spiritual aspect of white supremacy says in effect that death is antithetical to birth. And so people live in a chronic state of being born again or giving up the baggage that we all carry in order that we may become more fully human and more fully relational and more fully realized. So I often wonder, what does it mean to be socialized in a culture of fear? As an African American person, the world was unsafe, but we came at it during enslavement in a very different way. We decided in Black folk theology to imagine, even in the midst of our unsafe spaces, to imagine not only what we could become, but who other people also could become at their best. And so our spiritual offering to the society was agape. The ability to stand in one space while imagining another. And contrary to what the empire says, poor people are not without hope. It takes a lot to get up in the morning when all the odds are against you and hope and work for a better day. It takes a certain amount of spiritual genius to keep building and planning and fermenting generations when there's no evidence that your work will bear fruit. But you keep on planting and you keep on pruning generations. The cynicism and the hopelessness lies in the empire, who do not believe in change. who cannot imagine a future that's better and different than what it is in the present. It is a hopelessness that's bankrupt of hindsight, insight, and foresight. And so we must begin to reconsider how we understand words like hope and hopelessness. There's something very cynical and very hopeless when you believe that you have to contain people and hold in their possibilities in order for you to stand as tall as you might be. Not to believe in the possibility of harmonizing the I with the we, and to work to build that even in the face of adversity, and to promote an alternative otherness is cynicism. Hope is a gathering like this with the courage to wade deeply in waters that might be turbulent and might be troubled, but the belief that you can come out without being drowned. That is hope. So where does all of this tie into the reflection that I've shared and offered this morning? Cheryl and I were forced to move out of our home in Atlanta because we had a flood. The landlord who owned the house, from his negligence, we had a flood. And the house was overwhelmed with bacteria and mold. The pipes burst. And it was an unsafe house, and we had to move. And we have been vagabonds for the last 2 months, 3 months, living in hotels, paying our own hotel bill because the landlord refused to compensate us for anything. And we're in a struggle to try to recover. We had to send out 20 boxes of historical documents of the Black Civil Rights Movement and also the women's movement and peace movement. All of the documents destroyed. We had to send them out to try to freeze dry them, and that has been a successful process. So we said, okay, basically, we are semi-homeless. Where do we go from here? And we decided that Cheryl would go to take this opportunity to be with her son, to sit with him, because he's in a hospital, he's a schizophrenic, and that she understands that that in order for him to get to the next level, she's going to have to tarry and walk with him because of his profound faith and trust in her and his deep love and how much he improves when she's with him. I felt like I don't like to fly, and a lot of the work that I do is in the northeastern, southeastern corridor. So I would move to New York. And so we did. And we got a really wonderful sublet from a faculty member at NYU. And then the trouble began. We looked for an apartment, discovered that you have to have a broker, and you have to give that broker 15 to 20% of the annual cost of the apartment, not the monthly cost. In addition to that, you have to make 40 times what the monthly rent is, not 10%, but 40 times. Do you hear me? Are you with me? In addition to that, my people, you have to show 2 pages of your tax return. Are you getting where I'm headed? In addition to that, you have to have ID cards. This has deep ramification in New York, which is a gathering place oftentimes for immigrants who are struggling to have their papers. Are you following? And these are black and brown people. If you are a working poor person who's been unemployed for a year and can't find work in New York City, Is a bad credit report an indication of deficit in one's character? Or does it mean that it's a reality of what it means when you don't have a job, when you're living from paycheck to paycheck? Unemployment rate in New York is very high among people of color. Are you following me, my people? And even I, who work constantly speaking all over the country, making speaking fees, some real estate agents have told me that I'm not qualified because I don't punch a clock. So I've had a hard time finding a place. My friend who's going to move in with me is Reverend Nancy Talbot. She's the stated clerk of the Senate of the Northeast. I'm black and she's white. And the standards for her have been less than the standards for me. And we bear witness to that every day. Are you with me, my people? Donald Trump says that he's going to send troops into Chicago. Let's be very clear. When the President of the United States, who sits at the head of the federal apparatus, sends troops into a city, that's the federalization and militarization of that city. That's using federal troops. That's militarization on a federal level. So the President of the United States has declared war on a particular community in a particular city. And I want to ask you, why is he declaring war on the South Side when allegedly the crime is happening on the West Side? Because the South Side abuts the lake. Are you with me, my people? How many of you have lived with the drama and the propaganda of the last 40 years that have depicted black people as living in New Jack cities, as being immoral thugs and drug addicts, crack mothers, who have understood ever since the quality of life laws came into being that said that basically homeless people, black people, and all other people eroded the quality of life in cities. Let's be very clear about that. Unlike industrialism, technocracy, the heartbeat of technocracy, as Jacques Ellul says, who wrote the Technological Society in the 1950s, is that the city is the heartbeat of technocracy. It is a reason why gentrification is in operation. There's a reason why American cities are being whitened. And when we look at that, this is a dangerous 21st century apartheid system that has deep ramifications in a society where Bessie DeVoe wants to privatize and dismantle public schooling, where 90% of kids who attend public schools are kids of color, where Donald Trump wants to dismantle affirmative action and deny black kids access to education in the Northeast, where there are no historically black colleges, where he has attacked the historically black college history and system, where the housing patterns push black people out into what will become 21st century townships. Are you with me, my people? We are witnessing what America witnessed in response to Reconstruction and in response to the abolitionist movement with the rise of Southern apartheid in the 1880s and the 1890s. And conversely, we see the same vigilante violence emerging from the ranks of white America. We also see a black elite seduced by the opiates of materialism and the benefits of the empire, who forgot that the mission was not to be integrated into a burning house, as Martin Luther King said, but the mission was to set the house in order. It was not to break through the glass ceiling because the roof is rotten. We don't want to break through the glass ceiling. We want to create a new ceiling that's a democratized and a spiritual relational center. I want to ask, Have you been bear witness? Have you understood that before the ink was dry on the civil rights legislation under LBJ, that I'm sorry, I hope I don't offend Republicans, but you must bear responsibility for the party that you claim, have been undermining through the judiciary process, the legislative and executive process, the gains of the Southern Freedom Movement, whether it's through dismantling the Brown versus, working with the American Legislative Exchange Council. How many of you know ALEC? Not enough hands. How many of you know ALEC? And I heard that you're an educated group of people, so everybody in here should know ALEC, right? The American Legislative Exchange Council. How many of you know the Southern Strategy? How many of you know about the orchestra pit theory that was developed by Roger Ailes? That if you create sensational news every day and have people look at and orchestrate that news every day, then people will be steered away from the fundamental issues of the day. That was something developed by Roger Ailes, who sensationalized the news. That's what Fox was very good at. And so here we are. And I was thinking this morning, and I hope you can hear me despite whatever political views you hold. We have sunk into a spiritual and moral pit that is reflected by the degradation of the presidency as reflected through the debates. When Trump actually brought Bill Clinton's ex-quote-unquote girlfriends to a presidential debate and had a press conference designed to humiliate, degrade, and dehumanize Hillary Clinton. And we elected this man who degraded the office of the presidency and those who degraded the debates to that level. And not only did he do it, he held a press conference. And yet she was criminalized and he was glorified. So it's not just about what is wrong with Donald Trump. What is wrong with us? What is wrong with us that we would have engaged in that kind of dehumanization at a woman whose only crime was that she was married to a man who was a philanderer, who philandered? What was the pleasure in that kind of dehumanization? What was the hate so deep in people's hearts that they took pleasure and thought that there was nothing wrong with that? This country will never be whole until it gives Hillary Clinton an apology for the way in which she was treated, degraded, the way that people wanted her to cry, to break her spirit. And 87% of black women voted for Hillary Clinton, not because we were perfect, because if we waited on the perfect politician, we'd never vote. But we voted for her because we are black women who've been scorned, who've been vilified, and who've been dehumanized. And we understood what it takes to wake up in the morning in the face of those assaults and deport yourself with dignity and some degree of compassion without becoming broken-winged birds. And it was on that note that we voted for Hillary Clinton, because we identified and we admired her. But I want to ask white women who didn't vote for her, what is it that you didn't identify in her? What is it that you thought Donald Trump personified that she didn't personify? What would make women take some pleasure out of seeing a woman? We didn't take men to task for their wives who had committed adultery. They were not on display. They were not asked to bear the scarlet letter. Basically, Hillary Clinton was asked to bear the scarlet letter for what her husband had done. Where was our sense of righteousness, our sense of compassion? That is the mirror that reflects the American soul, and most particularly, some aspects of the American white soul. We can feel good that say that Donald Trump is this and he's that, but Donald Trump didn't make himself. He couldn't have gotten that office because of who he was, because he made it happen. The question is, what is the spiritual malformation that has brought us to this point? And I say that white supremacy is an evolving spiritual disease that rots out our inner and outer lives, that clogs us up with the bitter bowel of hatred, disassociation, delusion, and historical lies. I know some of you might say, wow, that's hard-hitting. Wow, what is she talking about? But it's hard. When your ancestors gathered in the face of enslavement and decided to go deep inside of themselves, it was not easy to stand up in the face of all of that and come out against enslavement. This journey is never easy, and it's not about a head thing without a heart thing. It's to make the connection between the head and the heart. And so we are living in very critical times. And I ask you to open up your hearts and see what's happening to your black and brown brothers, and to see what's sisters, see what's happening. Oh yes, let me just say this, then I'm going to end. We must develop a new language for talking about these white supremacy in the 21st century. And that language must be a spiritual language. Do not call another black or brown person marginalized, because that means that you see the person strictly through the system, through systemic eyes. Because in my community with other black people, I'm not marginalized. I am significant. And unless you see the structure, the system as a total lens to view people, then of course you see me as marginalized. But the question is, I'm both marginalized and essential. And somebody in Appalachia who cannot make a living is both marginalized and essential. And so we've got to stop, and it's not about, I am a privileged black woman. I went to an Ivy League school. I went to a very wealthy Episcopal school. When that person in Appalachia looks at me and say I'm privileged, they're absolutely right. But what I am not, no matter how many elite schools I've been to, I'm black and I don't have the same rights as that person in Appalachia. So we've got to stop talking about privilege. It's a wrong word to use. The question is, we're in this for rights, to democratize America. And so that poor white people do not have the same privilege as wealthy white people. So stop blurring the lines. Stop pretending that there's no class in this society. Stop wanting to, it's really important that if you think there's some virtue in working with black people to rid us of the canker of racism, I don't see a whole lot of people rushing to work with white people, poor white people. Why is it that white people don't want to work with other white people? I don't get it. What is so frightening about that? Because the truth of the matter is there's classism in the society. And the only way that we're going to get rid of white supremacy is to expose that classism. As long as people look at whiteness as a situation where all white people have the same privileges, then why would, you're not going to, that's a false illusion. That's a monolith. We've got to come face to face with class. We've got to come face to face with heterosexism. We've got to come face to face with all of the isms that not only shatter the humanities of other people, but tear our own humanities to pieces. I'm asking you, I come to you on humble and bended knees this morning to say there's deep troubling in America. My people are being dispersed, forced out of their homes by the real estate industrial complex, surrounded by churches everywhere, and the church cannot see and does not want to see. And I ask you to go inside of your hearts this morning and find that space where you can understand what does it mean to be a black person, to work for 100 years to build up Harlem on our sweat, blood, and tears, and create a culture that people find exotic. And now everybody wants to repossess land that they once dismissed as dungeons of disease and sit in inner cities. Don't say inner cities anymore. We are neighborhoods. We're not an inner city. And so we've got to humanize how we talk about people. And so I have been, sometimes when you do this work, and I'll close, you don't look for issues, they find you. And this issue has found me. And Cheryl can tell you I haven't shut up since it found me. They live with my rants every day. And I'm determined that my penultimate statement, as I close out my journey in life, will be to add my voice to this movement of dispersion and a capitalist technocracy. A global technocracy which explains that has banned, there's no more the Cold War, there's a culture war. And the culture is the maintenance of white supremacy in a growing demographic colored world. And that is the bind that brings Donald Trump together with Donald Trump. When you look at the right-wing movements that he spawned in Europe, and the fact that at some of Trump's campaign sites, Nigel Farage came over to be with him. We must be honest and truthful. Whoever thought that this, my generation, the radicals, would now leave behind for young people a world worse than what we are like the people that we fought against. We now can understand how they allowed it to build up like that, right? We can understand with some compassion what was going on with them. Why after the abolitionist movement and black reconstruction, suddenly there was a 100 years of Southern apartheid and tyranny. Where were the good folk? And I say there were good folk. But why were they not speaking out? And so we have been humbled to recognize that which is in us that was also in them, and that which is in them that was also in us. History teaches us to be humble, if nothing else. Thank you.